Good evening, everyone. Tonight is a work session of the South Kingstown Planning Board. The date is Thursday, October 13, 2022. The time is now 3 minutes past 7. The first item on our agenda is roll call. Susan Axelrod.
Here.
Joe Murphy.
Here.
Paul Jordan is absent. Peter DiStefano. Here. Liz Karp is absent. Robin Pothier is absent. And Maria Mack is here. Our next agenda item is a zoning text amendment, Jerry Brown Farm Road, review and discussion on a zoning amendment application submitted by the Jerry Brown Farm Association, Inc., to amend the zoning ordinance to clarify the rules and calculations for the 50% limitation on the expansion of structures deemed to represent a non-conforming use. Is there anyone representing the applicant? As long as the
Don, is the mic on?
mic can pick up your, is it on?
I shut it back off. Should be red.
So if you see the red light,
It's on.
Is that better?
Yeah.
So I think you were all here the last time we were before you about a year and a half ago. Jerry Brown Farm is a neighborhood kind of near East Matunic. It fronts on Salt Pond. It's at the end of Jerry Brown Farm Road. It's 70 acres in size, and there's 36 existing single-family residences, and it's in an R80 zoning district. The original owner leased the houses out to people during the summer, and it ended up turning into a year-round neighborhood, but it was always leased land. It predates zoning, so it's considered non-conforming. The current owners, when you buy a house in there, you get a bill of sale for the house, and you also get a share of stock in the Jerry Brown Farm Association Corporation. And then you also get a campsite agreement, which allows you the use of a certain area around your house. I handed out some material. The first part of it includes the site committee procedures, the bylaws. So the association has very strict rules on what everybody can do in there. If you want to trim a tree, you have to go and get approval for that. If you want to add onto your house, you have to get approval. So they've been doing that for years. They're very organized. I included in there, there's a aerial photograph that shows the actual houses. And you can kind of see the layout. So that's 70 acres. So everything's pretty spread out there. The next picture shows the association maintenance areas. Because the association owns the land, they maintain the parts that aren't in a campsite. So they maintain the roads and then also the vegetation in other areas. And then I gave you some samples of just what the campsites look like. So as you can see, they're kind of sort of like lots that people have the exclusive use of, and then just some photographs from Jerry Brown out to Salt Pond. So a few years ago, one of the members of Jerry Brown applied to the zoning board because it's non-conforming. Whenever somebody adds onto a house, they have to get a special use permit to expand the non-conforming use. The prior building official, Russell Brown, always found that the expansion, because they weren't increasing the number of houses, which is why it was non-conforming, that they didn't have to comply with the section of the zoning ordinance that says a non-conforming use can only be expanded by 50% of floor area. When Bo left, the new building official read it to mean that they were limited to 50%. And we had one of the owners there had a 800 square foot cottage that was uninhabitable, was looking to demolish it, construct a newer, bigger house, but he would be limited to 1,200 square feet. So we appealed that to the zoning board, and the zoning board determined that 50% rule didn't apply individually to each house, but to all the houses together. And what's that done is kind of has a burden on the association because they have to keep track of whenever somebody adds on and apportion those out. So it's difficult for them to have to tell somebody, you can add on, but you can't, because we might need that square footage in the future. So we originally came here and requested an amendment to the zoning ordinance that would exempt residential lots that have more than one house on them from the 50% requirement. And the board expressed concern that that would impact more properties in town, which could be a problem. I think everybody would agree that in this neighborhood, 70 acres, 36 houses that are relatively spread out, there isn't much detriment to people adding on to their houses. The lot coverage there is minuscule. So what we did is we did it as a overlay district. We had met with the planners. They mentioned possibly a floating zone. You don't really have that in your zoning ordinance, so we went with the overlay district. But essentially, it would still require that any changes to a house, any expansion, would require a special use permit with the zoning board. It would require approval from the association. We added in some additional setback requirements. We did a lot coverage maximum for the entire lot of 10%, which in R80, I believe it's 20%, so it's half of what is normally required there. And we thought this would give the association some relief for having to calculate that 50% rule, give the zoning board some parameters on approving development there. They have to be a certain distance from the private roads in there. They have to be a certain distance between buildings, a certain distance between residential units, and that'd really be mostly for fire safety. And then also reviewing any septic systems, and any expansion would have to, of course, comply with CRMC and DEM. So we thought this would, there's not much to it, but it would give a little more clarity to the zoning board, and then also allow the owners some more guidance on exactly what procedure they had to follow in order to improve their house. So with me tonight is Hank DeMarco. He's the president of the association. He's lived there since 1999. So he can answer you have any questions you have regarding the association. Sure.
Can you,
You're going to speak,
can
you
you
need
use the
to
mic,
come up
please?
to the mic and state your name for the record.
Good evening. My name is Hank DeMarco. I've been a resident of Jerry Brown Farms since, I guess it was January 2000. I must say this is a unique piece of property, the association, that is different from anything that I've seen in my lifetime. And although probably the first year I was there, I thought the controls that they had were maybe pushing the limit from what you had to do to get any change made at Jerry Brown Farm. But now that I've been there for a while, it seems that it keeps the neighborhood intact. And I'll give you some examples of that, just so if you're not familiar with it, you can understand the way we manage the Jerry Brown Farm. There's 36 houses. There can never be any more. So we don't have to worry about density increasing by us putting up condos or additional houses. The houses that are there are owned by individuals, the house, And as John said, we each have a share of stock in the 70 acres. But any change, mailbox, flagpole, birdhouse, or something complex like a screen porch, deck, or raising the roof or knocking the building down, has to go through an approval process within Jerry Brown Farm. It's done that so that the neighbors were all comfortable with what is happening to the Jerry Brown Farm Association. After you have vetted your change with neighbors, and it's you know, a very handshake type of, not contractual. You show your neighbors what you're going to do. They make advice on changes. It's usually the priority is water view, but I will say sometimes it's aesthetics, privacy, you know, anything that your neighbor thinks would either change the value of his house, make it go up or down, and they get an opinion. Then you go to a site committee, and there's a chairman. Marshall Rauchi is the chair now. He's probably been here before. And there's 6 to 7 Jerry Brown Farm members that also take a look at what the changes you're going to make. After that has all been vetted, and I've been there now 22 years, and I'd say it's always been vetted and agreed to before anything comes here. It goes to the zoning board for approval. And we come here to show that, one, we're going to meet all the, what I would say, normal, you know, licensed and particulars of building a house, fire, you know, septic, CRMC, height requirements are all met. And the zoning board says yay or nay. And since I've been here, the zoning board always approved what had gone through the Jerry Brown Farm. I don't think, it wasn't a rubber stamp, but it was, you know, I think we did our due diligence before it came here. And it was a pretty good process. It took a while. It's the longest process I've ever seen. If you want to put a shed at Jerry Brown Farm, it takes a year to get approval to put a shed in. And, you know, that's longer than I'm used to in other parts of the country. But it keeps everybody happy with, you know, the area that we have and the complexity. And I believe the square footage rule that was put in place from a density standpoint originally had to do to make sure that areas that were non-conforming, like Jerry Brown Farm, didn't get out of control, either too dense or impact a neighbor or the area that they were in. But our process seems to, and at least it's worked till now, control that. When Dan Cunningham came forward, and the 50% rule came out. Of course, he didn't meet it. You know, he was up like 300% more. It was an awakening to all of us. I'd been here for minor additions, but the 50% requirement or recommendation never came into play in the 20 years that I was here previously. It was, you know, it was new news to us. And recognize that the law has been there, but, you know, we haven't had to have it followed for what we were bringing forward. It's kind of cumbersome in a way, because now we've taken an allotment of square footage to the 36 folks that are there, and there's probably about 10 people that have done knockdowns in the area over the last 25 years, or since 1999, and they have used up that square footage. So, you know, the 6 or 7 that have used it up, there's 30 people that at some point, somebody is not going to have enough to make even a minor change to their house. And I'll use the Thorkelsons, who just came here about a month ago. They've been there 100 years. The daughter is now taking the Thorkelson cottage and going to make it a full-time house. But she needed a basement, and she's investing, you know, $400,000 in that upgrade, and it's going to be good for everybody at Jerry Brown Farm and South County, in my opinion. It's going to increase the value in taxpayer dollars. But a basement doubles the size of their house. So again, Jerry Brown Farm, we want them to do that. They've been there for 100 years. We're taking that allotment away from other folks who haven't come forward yet. So we're kind of kicking this can down the road. And it doesn't seem, I'm not going to use, I probably use the wrong language, not that it's not fair, because we are following the rules now, or the law as written. But at some point, this will be problematic to the folks that haven't made their changes yet. I, for one, in my small house on the water, I've used up all of my square footage allotment for the 50%. Matter of fact, I just put in, I was here a year ago to put a garage in. I started at 24 by 24, and to stay within the 50%, I had to make it 21 by 20. I can live with that, and that's what I went with. So I built that garage. I'm very happy with it. But you normally don't go through that in any other development that I've been used to looking at. So I'm thinking that maybe what should happen, because rules are sometimes applied for everyone, is that you folks and whoever is taking a look at the reasonableness of this should come down to Jerry Brown Farm and look at our density, look at how we're managing things, and see does it make sense for this 50% to apply here. We'll follow everything else. We'll continue to come here, continue to get the zoning approval, follow all the building codes, fire codes, CRMC codes that are required. But the 50% one, at this stage, seems to be, I'll use the words, I'm not sure what control that does on somebody. 50% is not much. Matter of fact now, a screen porch, a deck, all of that counts into the 50%. So, you're almost telling somebody that owns a piece of property, if I was to sell the house, I'd try to have to tell whoever the new buyer is, you're done. Whatever you have here, you cannot make a change. You can't even move a deck a half a foot. You can't enclose your porch. It just seems that this requirement hurts the 36 folks that are there at some point. And not like the folks across the pond. I look at Great Island, and Great Island has changed quite a bit since I've been there. There's a second story almost in every house on the waterfront. And that's improved Great Island. It's good for the people, it's good for the taxpayers, it's good for South County. This 50% will limit that in Jerry Brown Farm. So I'm just trying to give some, light, and I'm done now. My wife will say I talk too much. And I don't know if anybody has any questions.
I'll ask board members when you finish up.
I'm done.
Questions from board members for Mr. DeMarco or Mr. Kenyon? Go ahead, Susan.
Welcome. I have
Thank
a
you.
couple of questions for you.
Sure.
And you may have answered them, but I have some notes here. Your ordinance application appears to start the clock back to now and say that anyone in the future can expand 50%, starting with the adoption of this new ordinance. So it looks to me like it'll set the clock back for the folks that you have that have already expanded will now get another 50%?
No.
That's the way I read the ordinance. Am I incorrect?
No, you're correct. So under the proposed ordinance, there would no longer be a 50% rule for Jerry Brown Farm. There would still be the lot coverage limitation. But someone that has completed construction before and wanted to add on, the 50% rule wouldn't apply to anyone in Jerry Brown.
So I think maybe I misunderstood. I had the impression that your ultimate goal was to make sure that Jerry Brown Farm didn't become a whole lot of McMansions piled next to each other, but that would open that door for each of these houses to then become a very large house? Is that, that's a potential, is that?
There's a potential, so there's no size limitation other than the lot coverage. But there is the distance between buildings, and if you look at the aerial, the houses down by the water are relatively close to each other, so that would limit their expansion. The houses that are in back, that are away from the water, they're more secluded, they would have more room to be able to expand.
So they would only be limited by their expansion because of their setback limits to the neighbors?
And when I say neighbors, I'm not talking about the other lots, talking about the neighbors in Jerry Brown, the other houses.
Yes, and their immediate neighbors. Got it. Okay, so I did read that correctly. So,
The only thing I'd like to add to that, I'm not sure what through this completely.
Just restate your name if you're going to speak again, so that the tape picks up.
This is Hank DeMarco again. There are 2 other houses at Jerry Brown Farm that do not have a basement, and at some point, I could foresee in the future, they'd want to redo those houses. If they put, a knockdown, and you're in this business, so you're going to build a new house, you probably want to put a basement in. And just by doing that, there would be 100% increase in the square footage of that house, just by putting a basement in. So that's where this 50% expansion becomes a little problematic in a practical sense if you look at the individuals. It wouldn't, nobody would know it except the homeowner, because now he has, or she has a basement. But it would be more than 50% of the current square footage, even if they didn't change the outside of the house at all.
So I understand that. Somewhere in some of the material I read, it also talked about, though, changing the footprint. So if they didn't change the footprint, but did go down a story, that, I'm confused about whether it's the old material or the new material, but I had the impression that that was permitted as long as the footprint didn't change.
As long as you stayed in the footprint, but you also can't expand your floor area. So expansion of the floor area would put you. So under the,
So there was a conflict there where it permitted you to build on your footprint, but you couldn't add your square footage vertically.
the idea was you could rebuild a house on the same footprint, the same exact size, without going to the zoning. But if you change the location or increase the size of it, which would include putting a basement in, then you'd have to go to the zoning. And that's kind of when this started, was David Cunningham's house was 800 square feet with no basement. So in order to put in a basement, he was going to have to cut that down to 600 square feet per floor. So when they're including the gross floor area, they're including, as Hank said, screened-in porches, basement.
Okay.
So making it 50% really hurts you considerable.
And that's whether or not the basement is living space.
Correct.
Just having a basement, even if it's just for storage,
Correct.
counts toward your square footage?
Susan, I'll just elaborate from the town side, because I've worked on a number of applications for properties like this. You would think, if somebody wants to put a basement in, it shouldn't count. But if they finish the basement, that's living space. Once you give the approval, how do you go back and try to reel that in? You can't. Porches, screened-in porches, let's just say they don't put windows in, insulate it, and it becomes a 3-season room, and then eventually becomes an extension of their living room. Once you permit it, and the modifications continue to happen. So there are some checks and balances there that seem a little egregious, but they're there for a reason, because it's a enforcement nightmare if we don't consider it.
Yes. Thank you for the clarification. I was just trying to understand from what I was reading, and I think I have one more question. Okay, so the other question I have is that in here, there's a conflict for me. It said if structures are considered conforming, but then they also need to adhere to Section 203 for non-conforming. So it seems to refer back to adhering to Section 203, which is written for non-conforming, but all of these houses will become conforming.
It's true.
The intent was that they pass in this, they would be considered conforming, but they still have to apply for a special use permit, which I think might be under Section 907.
Okay, I think that's all my... Okay, thank you.
I have a couple of questions, primarily, though, for Peter and Jay and Jamie. This is essentially creating a new district, is that correct? But there aren't specific standards associated with that district?
So it would, in essence, be a change to the map, which in my view would require a map amendment, because it's a regulation written for a specific property. So you can call it an overlay zone. It is a new zone for this piece and this piece primarily alone. It's not a floating zone. We suggested master plan community, and this is what they chose. There is in essence, no perimeter setback. There is only a setback to Jerry Brown Road of 15 feet, and the only other dimensional setback is 30 feet between units. So those are the two kind of horizontal setbacks. So there's nothing within this zone that says you shall be X number of feet from a property line. It only says you shall be 15 feet away from Jerry Brown Road.
So that would make some of these diagrams that show sort of lot lines irrelevant. Is that correct?
We asked that they master plan it and in essence show lease lines. They continued to tell us there are no lines. But yet they show us lines in their submission.
Diagrams are not really relevant then.
The only reason those lines are in, and that's new, is to manage the growth of trees. Just who's going to cut what tree to what height. You know,
But I think
value everything as an individual, whether it's looking at trees, water, you know, the birds. Some folks really think when you're on the water that the number one value is your view of the water. So we spend more time at Jerry Brown Farm in managing tree and brush committee than as much time as house changes. And this worked very well, by the way. So, you know, I am not aware, and I've only been there 22 years, but I hear in 100, nobody's sued another person, nobody's been, you know, not neighborly. We work things out, and drawing those lines to what height you should keep what bush has made things so that it's easy to talk about the maintenance, and that's the only reason it's there.
So, Jamie, to what degree then would we be creating complete autonomy to this or any future homeowners association and committees?
I think I'll try to address that, and it may take me a few sentences to do that.
Sure.
I think what you have is a regulation before you that creates a brand-new zoning classification. It has the zone doesn't have a minimum acreage, so it doesn't say that the land couldn't be subdivided in the future. There's no, this zone shall have a minimum of 70 acres. We have testimony that there shall be no more than 36 lots, but based on the language, those 36 lots could account for 304,920 square feet of building coverage, which equates to 8,470 square feet on average for a unit. So you've heard testimony tonight that they have concerns that the 50% increase is limiting. So they're going from a 50% increase, which would roughly be 1,200 square feet, in the example they gave you, to 8,470 as an average. So with regard to zoning control, if you were to adopt this, you're in essence creating two kind of permitting processes. One is, as was explained to you, and Susan asked a good question, if someone has an existing cottage, and we'll say it's 1,000 square feet, and it's not winterized, and someone decided that it's economically feasible to tear that down, rebuild it on its exact footprint, they could do that as a permitted use as of right, and only would need a building permit. If they decided to go to 1,200 square feet, they would have to go to the zoning board for a special use permit under I believe it's 907-2A. If you read the criteria for 907-2A, it says one of the criteria is it has to be consistent in harmony with the surrounding properties. I'm not sure, and council may weigh on this, is it the surrounding properties of the 35 units next to it, or is it the surrounding zone? If it's the surrounding zone, I'm not sure how you find uniformity and conformity with that. So, but what the second part of this is, they're saying when we create this zone, the homeowners association becomes the zoning board. So you're, in my view, delegating approval authority on final setbacks, final building footprints, final building height, and locational elements to a homeowners association. And again, if they were building within their footprint, it would be permitted use as of right. If they're expanding, once they get their special use, the zoning board is only weighing criteria for the special use. As long as, the dimensional requirements are so long as they're 30 feet away from each other, 20 feet from a structure, and as long as they don't exceed in totality for all 36 units, the 304,000 square feet, I'm not sure how the zoning board says no. And if they did a strict adherence to their special use, I think there's a question of whether they can grant the permit.
And not to complicate things, but say some future version of the homeowners association, were they to change the zoning to have this new classification, what would be the potential ramifications, if at all, of something like ADUs within the site?
I want to say, reading the language, and again, we have counsel here, it limits 36 dwelling units. So if someone added an ADU, you would have to subtract from another. But again, state law and other aspects could potentially affect that. But again, we have counsel here, and again, their limiting factor, I think, in their language is 36 units, but I'm not an expert on whether that could change or whether there's a state law that says you can't prohibit an AD unit from occurring on a property. The difficulty is there's one property here, so do you get one ADU for all 36 units? Because there's only one property. We're told there's no property lines, yet they testified that each owner has a piece of land that they get, and they get to utilize that land, and I'm sure someone doesn't put their lawn chair in front of someone else's unit, whether that's neighborly or understood by the homeowner association that you have a lot that goes with your home. Again, we were more, it's tough when the intent of a town is to find uniformity throughout their zoning districts, and this potentially could be viewed as bringing uniformity within their 70 acres, but not uniformity within the area. This is a difficult scenario because it is a historic development, but it was built in essence as a seasonal facility that over time, people are turning those seasonals into full year-round units. And again, that's the normal progression. We've seen that throughout the United States. It's not just a Rhode Island thing or an East Coast thing. It's happening around the country. But I think there may be a better way to do it than an overlay district, but that would require the homeowner association to establish, in essence, lots and standards within development of their lots. In essence, create, call it an R5000 zone, so there'd be some clarity of what ultimately gets built there. There's nothing in here, from my view, that would prevent someone from buying 3 properties and then having the zoning permit internal is their own HOA, combining those 3 properties and then building a larger home. It's just understanding what you approve of what potentially could occur here. I'm not saying that acquiring 3 properties and building a larger home is a bad thing. It could be viewed as a good thing. It's just the natural evolution of a kind of a beachfront type community that was built for one intended purposes, that has gone through a generational aspiration to, summer to full-time.
So just to briefly touch on the questions you raised, Madam Chair. First, to the ADU question. As I'm sure the board is aware, there was legislation recently enacted this year that addresses accessory family dwelling units. And essentially, it allows accessory family dwelling units by right within single-family residences for family members. You can have reasonable dimensional regulations on that, but if there aren't any dimensional regulations that would prohibit it, then it would be allowed. So the second issue that was raised, and actually an issue that I have a little bit of concern with reviewing the ordinance, is looking at section 610.8, and that's the section that specifically incorporates into the zoning ordinance approval by the Jerry Brown Farm Association and the site committee of that association. And I actually, so I'm sure they have private covenants that apply to their property, and they may, as a private matter, require that. But I have an issue with incorporating it into the zoning ordinance, because then it becomes a question of, is that something that the town now needs to enforce if their private association won't give, site approval for a particular individual? And, I'm not saying this applies to the current membership, but say somewhere down the line, this remains in the ordinance, someone has a fight with their association, their homeowners association, and now it's been almost as if that's been incorporated as an instrumentality of the town, because they need to give the sign off before the town can give further approval. And if they're doing it for an inappropriate reason, not giving the sign off, if it was a town official or a town board, then we could come in and say, what you're doing is incorrect, you have to change what you're doing. We can't really say that to the Jerry Brown Farm Association because they're private. So I think they can have that structure, but it should be kept separate from the zoning ordinance, and they can handle that privately.
Actually, it's there because the first thing you're always asked if you come to the zoning.
Hank, if you can't hear the echo, the recording won't pick you up, sorry.
Yeah, and could you just wait until we finish asking
All right.
questions? And then, last thing, Peter, Jamie J., one of the things we always are concerned with is precedent setting. Would this set any kind of precedent that another similar situation could then say, well, we want to create our own overlay in our own district and our own rules and regulations that would preempt, to a certain extent, the zoning board involvement?
I think council may advise you that when you're making recommendations to the council, they're acting legislatively, and that's kind of a single one-off decision. So it doesn't necessarily set precedents, but what can be argued is you did that for them. I have a similar scenario. Why aren't you doing it for me? And there can be a multitude of circumstances where you can say no, but if you had, apples for apples, you're not tied by setting a precedence, but it puts someone in an awkward position because you did it for someone else.
And can you briefly explain the scenario that you referenced? You called it a master planning something that staff had brought up.
So when we had a few meetings with Mr. Kenyon, and we're gracious for those sit-downs, and we were concerned in essence about just setting kind of a perimeter boundary of the 70 acres, and then in essence having the homeowners association primarily in charge of what happens within those boundaries, that we literally asked them to look at doing a build-out of the property as best they can anticipate, and then setting the parameters and basically developing a zoning code for that property. It could be called a, shoreline resort community. You don't call it an R5000. It's just within there, you build the parameters, which in essence, in my view, wouldn't require them to go get special use permits. They would be allowed to do things within that zone when they develop those standards. I think the discussion was that that would be a lot of work for them to do, and they weren't necessarily willing to undertake that because there were too many unknowns, and it kept going back to the homeowners association takes care of ourselves. We make the decisions, we have a good board, and I would potentially agree, you do have a good board today, you probably have in the past, but to council's point, it's non-regulatory, and you would be in a pretty big predicament if a landowner disagreed with the HOA and applied to the zoning board for a special use permit, and then the zoning official said, as they were reviewing the application, said, but you don't have the sign-off from the homeowners association. What legal standing does that person now have in the permitting process?
So you feel that there is a means by which criteria could be established so that they would be able to have a certain degree of expansion?
Yeah, again, I think their initial problem was the 50% rule. So, to me, a simple discussion is if you recreated a zone, you eliminate the ability, if that's their purview, and the board was simple, you eliminate that 50% calculating the basement, that you can build the basement can become part of the dwelling, and it will not be factored into the proposed increase. If the average size of what people want to build there is 3,000 square feet, write a regulation to accommodate the 3,000 square feet. But again, just going to a blanket, we have 10% of 70 acres, which is over 300,000 square feet, which averages just over 8,000 square feet per unit. And they say they don't want a big type housing development project. The regulations allow it to occur. And zoning regulations are institutional in their aspect, but they are an evolving, fluid document. But they're also generational. The first generation was there, wouldn't contemplate 5,000 or 6,000 square foot homes. They were content with what they had. So today, you could have an HOA who says, and again, they have no real regulatory authority, that we're not going to allow a building over 3,000 square feet and promise you to do that. That's non-regulatory. The next HOA that's self-policing, it's made up of the ownership, they elect themselves, could have a different opinion, and you don't have a regulation other than, so long as it doesn't exceed 300,000+ in total, there's no limitation on any size of a building, and there's no limitation on the ability to, because there are no lot lines. So someone will say there are 2 housing units and you can't build them closer than 30 feet apiece. There's nothing to prevent people from buying 2 of those housing units, tearing both down and building one big unit where it is. Other than that is probably not the way the HOA views something in a favorable manner today, but it doesn't mean it couldn't occur in the future.
So by establishing specific lot lines and mechanism for enforcement and criteria for expansion, that would then give them the ability to move forward.
I mean, we're referring to, whether they're lot lines or lease areas or, areas of influence.
Yeah, if I can, just real quick, just lines on a map and a plan, really distinguishing the lots. So from my perspective, it's pretty, I kind of dumb it down a little bit. This is non-conforming because you have more than one structure on one lot. The intent of zoning is to achieve compliance over time. You limit the expansion, you limit what they can do so it doesn't get much worse. They allow you to get a little bit more intense. So to solve that, what the association's trying to do is allow for more expansion of that to keep in kind with to keep in compliance with zoning and with neighboring properties. The concept was create a master plan that draws condo lot lines, call it what you will, lines on a map that says, here's lot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's in the R80 zone. Apply the R80 standards, and with the approval of a master plan, it would be considered compliant and with R80 setbacks and regulatory requirements applied to it. And at that point, they would be, from our perspective, functioning just like the R40 neighborhood to the west, where you have individual houses on individual lots. The R40 regulations apply to all of them. It would be the same thing for them if their plan and the map was approved. And it would serve the purpose of achieving the consistency that we're looking for. We would be, with that being approved, we'd be able to consider it just like we would any other property. And that concept could also carry over to the other parcels in town that have similar characteristics with more than one property on the lot. It would be available to them too, where you could say, you want to do something like Jerry Brown Farm just did, come up with a master plan, draw out, and we'll consider approving it, which would then lock you in for whatever that plan said and whatever the planning board approved, or the town approved, rather.
Just for clarity, Madam Chair, on a statement Jay said, and you referred to the dimensional requirements of the R40. Again, if they developed a master plan, there could be subsects within that. So you could look at this as a 70-acre development that has 4 zones. One of the zones is a 5,000 square foot area that has certain setbacks. Another component is the 10,000 square foot. Another is 20,000 square feet. Another one's 40,000 square feet. And each one of those subsects has their own standards. And to Mr. Kenyon's point earlier, and to Hank's point, Mr. DeMarco, there are some natural kind of defined areas. The units closest to the water are smaller in size, and as you get further away, it looks more traditional with size to, property sizes and home sizes. So again, that master plan could develop subsections or segments that develop their code, which give you, there could be a shoreline district 1 within the master plan, and you can do X, Y, and Z in that district. And in essence, those would be by right, so long as you do adhere to the dimensional aspects. And I think if you put a little thought into it now, you're actually gonna spend more time now, but less time in the future, where homeowners won't have to go to a special use permit. Someday, some neighbor who's mad at another neighbor who argues, and potentially in a court of law, that you didn't meet the special use criteria contained within the regulations, because there isn't uniformity. You're not like the other houses next to it, because I'm 500 square feet, and you propose 3,000. There's uniformity clauses within the special use criteria. Again, what we're trying to do is, again, if they spent a little more time now, I think it makes the permitting process in the future and totality more uniform and more predictable. Because again, this zoning board, this planning board, everyone could understand, but 10 years from now, 15 years, 20 years from now, Mr. DeMarco's talking about almost a 70-year swing between when people originally went in the 40s to now. It's actually 80 years. And this transition is occurring. I can't predict a year from now, never mind 80 years from now.
Other comments, board members? Joe?
John, of the 70 acres, are there any wetlands or other land non-suitable for development?
They haven't had them, studied to see whether there are wetlands. Looking at it, I mean, it's obviously along the water there. There's probably some of the coastal wetlands there. It's relatively dry. There might be a couple areas that are.
How about further up the hill? Is that the undeveloped land? More forestry? Is there any of that area, or is it all?
Jay just put it up.
Stick in front of lead duct.
So there is some wetlands. So, I guess, of the 36 houses, how many are on the water side of the Jerry Brown Road? Down there, the water there.
The way, when I looked at it, not exactly like that, but it appeared to me that there were probably 12 that would, what I would consider inland, and 24 that are along that water side.
So about 2/3 are. So, I guess where I'm trying to wrestle with, I understand the argument that the only reason why this is non-conforming is because it's a large parcel. Instead of being 36 individual parcels, it's a large parcel, but they average 80,000 square foot each. But I don't completely buy that, one, because we see some wetlands, and obviously the wetlands was not ruled out at the time that the lot was created, or even at the time when the lot was sold. The wetlands didn't come into effect until 1985 or 1986 or so. But also because it's almost as if we have two different developments there. There's one that's along the water, which is very high dense, and then there's one that's up the hill that's less dense. And I guess I would ask Jamie, and so I hear what you propose, and I think that's probably a good way to assess and understand the development. I mean, my concern would just be along the water, the density of that, and if those houses were allowed to develop significantly larger, and then how would that compare to the other properties to the left or to the right, and whether it would still be in conformance with the general character of the neighborhood. So that would be one, that would be the concern. But I guess I would ask, whether it be the zoning or the subdivision regulations, is there other type of developments where once they calculate out the number of units, we allow those houses to be closer in exchange for some open space? And is there something there that we could look to try to understand the distance between houses and how much further or what limitations we should place on the development of the houses closest to the water? I'm not concerned about the houses further up where, it's pretty spread. And how that would compare to whatever master plan they drew, and because I do think once there's a master plan, maybe there would be some limitations on the development of the houses near the water, but not necessarily the ones up the hill. So,
Jay has a couple thoughts on that, and then I can follow up on that.
And I think that's the value of doing the master plan. Because with the master plan, the town can look at, for instance, the image that's on the screen, look at the proposed imaginary boundary lines and saying, hey, those 6 lots right there are 20,000 square feet.
Yeah.
That should be R20, which has reduced setbacks because it's a higher intensity, higher density. And then in certain other places, you may be able to identify them just simply based on the size of the imaginary lots that they provide, which would then basically not self-govern it, but you would apply those more strict setbacks or less strict setback, however way you want to look at it. You wouldn't have like a 10-foot setback from the property line, you might get a 30. And that would help contain the amount of expansion or the size of the structure that they could do. And the idea is you would treat it almost like you are doing a reverse subdivision. You look at the roadway and you say, okay, it makes sense that this lot goes here and here and here, and its size is what it is as it's laid out today to help kind of frame it.
So I guess I agree with what you're proposing. I mean, I think that there should be some relief to this 50% limitation. But having that master plan, maybe some restrictions and limitations on the waterfront that not necessarily applicable further up, so I agree.
And I just want to add, Jerry, I don't mean to cut you off, but I've worked on a lot of zoning applications for these type of scenarios. I would raise my hand and be first in line to say, let's fix it, because they're headaches. You know, there's somebody who's going to be the odd man out. The expansion question, is it 25% expansion of the entire parcel or just each structure individually? You talk to two people, you get two different answers. And there's no real guidance for it. It's not articulated in zoning very well. So I think going something along the master plan lines is best for the town, and it's best for the property owner, because one of the explanations that was given to us was, you know, we want to be considered like any other development in town. Okay, well, let's figure out a way to get you to be compliant or in conformance, and then you will. And we believe that the master plan process would achieve that. Now, I don't know if it would achieve all of the objectives or that the association would like, but it's something that the town could apply on this lot and easily adopt it to other lots if they wanted to do the same thing, if they were in that same scenario.
So procedurally, how would that work? They would develop some type of master plan, and then that would be brought to staff? Or would that be eventually brought to the planning board for some type of review, or what?
Again, as I mentioned earlier, we had a few meetings with Mr. Kenyon in talking about what we potentially thought the best path for success would be, both in front of the planning board and then ultimately in front of town council. So if they put something together, we would be more than willing to sit down again and talk to them. I think to your point, Joe, there's a mix of this if they do the master plan. If they say the HOA is content with 36 units, you could structure the text amendment to say there's 70 acres and the maximum density is 2 units an acre. And just round math, that's 35 units. That doesn't quite work, so it may be 1.9 units per acre. So you would set the maximum density at 36 units. We seek guidance from council with regards to the ADU component and whether that would trump it. So technically, even though you're approving a density of 36, it could be 72 for kind of the granny pod associated with that, or the elder care pod associated with that. And, you know, there's a mechanism to potentially solve this problem. We just don't, it's difficult for us to get behind a proposal that sets a 70-acre parcel with limited regulatory control as it relates to uniformity within the site. That it's really left up to the HOA and then another permitting process that I'm not sure how. It's either I read the special use permit two ways. Either they're going to be driven to say no because you meet the criteria, or there's no way for them to say no because it's easy to meet the standards, right? They either have to say no if they apply the code, or if they don't, then how do you say no to any development on the site so long as the HOA approves it? And then the question is what happens on appeal?
Do we know how many other properties in the community are like this?
Similar. You could say Mary Carpenter's, Roy Carpenter's. There are some in the northeastern part of town around the lakes.
I did an analysis, and I shared it with John, but I didn't have time to vet it, but there was a considerable number of properties that were of a similar situation. What I couldn't do was go back and look and see how many were approved developments by the planning board or the zoning board. But I can answer in the affirmative that yes, there's more than probably a couple.
And Peter, we also have a number of family compounds that were developed under the regulations associated with family compounds, and we get calls, I want to say almost once a month, if not once every other month, of saying, I own a home in a family compound and I want to divide it again, or I want to change something, and we have to inform them that it's a family compound, and when that was originally divided, if it was 50 acres and divided into 6 lots as a family compound, it's forever 6 lots. You know, someone could argue this is forever what it was when it was originally designed. You know, sometimes it's a hard conversation with those individuals who just bought a property and now want to change something. Of why can't I subdivide it when there's ample acreage to do something there?
And those, many of those residential compounds were developed with a lesser degree of criteria simply because of the idea as a whole.
Thus the reason why no further subdivision, because you're letting up on the normal requirements to allow them to facilitate it.
Yeah, so I want to make it, we're not saying no to potentially solving the problem. We just feel there's a better widget.
I'd like to ask another question. Peter, are you done? Do you have other questions?
No, I was just going to say, I pretty much agree with what Joe was saying, and that's kind of the thought, and I would assume, sounds like we're all in a similar alignment that what's proposed, and I don't know if we need to beat this
Right.
the rest of the night.
It seems like it would create more predictability, but also flexibility for the residents.
I think long-term. The key is long-term. Less uncertainties 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years from now.
So I just have a couple of quick questions. Is there somehow a rule against any subdivision or selling a portion of this property? Like, is that a possibility if the homeowners association decided to carve off a piece and sell it for development? Is that prohibited, or does it need to be prohibited?
I defer to council, but it's an R80 zone, or R40, Joe?
Maybe
Or 80.
maybe I can answer that.
ahead.
In the past, the town has considered when you have a non-conforming property, when you reduce the size of that non-conforming property, it requires a special use permit, I believe. So you can do it, but you have to get special permission.
Okay. So my other question, can I buy one of the small houses somewhere and tear it down and then build a really big house somewhere else and still have 36 units on this property? Like, why, can you move a house, as opposed to rebuilding on the footprint? I'm not sure I can't tear down a house and then build a really big house where I have more elbow room.
So you can buy a physical piece of property, and that's what, I mortgage my house.
Yep.
That's what the bank mortgages. I cannot take it down and then build a house somewhere else at Jerry Brown Farm today. It's never happened.
But that's an association rule.
Right. Doesn't mean.
But in this ordinance, I think I could. Okay. And so I know that you've thought this through, and you've said that, you all need to come together to make a decision about a birdhouse. And this is maybe not relevant, but are all of your homeowners on board with what changes this might bring to the spirit and the aesthetic of your community if this ordinance passed and each house then rebuilt itself as a 5,000 square foot house and would change your aesthetic, and then you can't put that back in the box? And I wonder if you, and your board sounds fabulous, but having served on small nonprofit boards, you can't predict who's in charge when they get their friends in charge 10 or 20 years down the road. And you could have some people with very different ideas. So,
First, before you can go to the site committee, you have to go to every affected neighbor and ask, are they okay with what change you're gonna make, whatever change?
right,
Putting a second story on, and they, you vet it and actually build a little structure to show exactly what you're gonna do. Get their approval, the 5 people is directly around you.
right.
And the site committee looks at it. 5 people that are affected, along with all other 35 people at Jerry Brown Farm, before we could go get a building permit. So we need a letter they get a building permit that says Cherry Brown Farm has looked at it and said it's okay with the neighbors. And then we come to the zoning board after we send a letter to all the surrounding folks to get the zoning approved for special use permit.
But I,
That's the control point.
but I think with this ordinance, you could have potentially a small minority of people in power permitting,
Yeah, why don't
Okay,
we?
sorry,
why don't
sorry.
we-
I don't need to
I
talk
think
about
we,
this.
we have some consensus on the
Okay.
board. We have other things on the agenda tonight. I think the feeling is that you folks could move forward with a master plan idea and have both the flexibility and the predictability that is desired.
Are you talking about a master plan where we have to deed lot lines and survey, or a master plan like we say, I'm not trying to dumb this
Yeah.
down, but we draw a line to say, you know what, the Hank, that's your vertical property. You mow it today, you take care of it
Right.
today, and, you know, you're gonna say, Mr. DeMarco, that's your property line.
We're not looking for any deeded rights. It's just basically getting you to look at your 70 acres and how it would be built out. And I'm confident, once you go through that endeavor, you'll realize you probably have 4 unique zones within your 70 acres.
Setbacks standpoint.
From setbacks, heights, you know, you may want to, the southeast corner, you may say these are all, 4,000 square foot type properties, and they shouldn't be over 30 feet. So within your master plan, District SE, standing for Southeast, would have dimensional zoning requirements associated with that. Then you have an NE, the northeast corner is a little bit different. And then as you head upland, you may have 2 more distinct zones. And it's not lot lines. They're not deeded lot lines.
Consider them a site, consider it a site.
A logical build-out that we could foresee,
Yes.
crystal ball, we get person to person.
Yep.
Right. If you were to turn this into a subdivision, what would that subdivision plan look like? You'd have the road carved out, you'd have lots surrounding each building. What's the size of those lots? And we would look at the dimensional requirements for that. Let's say it was a 20,000 square foot lot, and we say, well, how does the R20 setbacks apply to that? Does it work? And it would be more in line to get you in line with that.
Then it's a 50% still.
No, no. So you would have, if this were to go through, you would have a front yard setback, side, rear, height, coverage on that, each individual site.
So I think that makes sense. I mean, obviously, we'd have to talk with the other association members. When we first came before you and there was mention of a master plan with lot lines, we were concerned that there were actual lot lines.
That we'd have to
Which
redeed the property.
Which would be a huge problem tax-wise and a number of reasons why.
No.
I did want to say, when you zoomed in on the houses on the water, that was why we had the 30-foot setback, because they're really limited where they could expand. And when we met with Jamie and Jay, we discussed the different areas here, and under the proposed ordinance, they'd be really limited what they can do, which the rest of the people in the association want, because that's their water pool. So they don't want those houses on the water to expand a lot. With the ones in back, they don't care as much.
Yep.
I think doing the master plan, we could do the same sort of thing there. Regarding the association approval, we put that in there because I think that's how it is now. That when someone files a zoning application, I thought they needed to have the Jerry Brown Farm approval in order to move forward, because the association owns the property. So when you file a zoning application, the owner has to
Sign off
Yeah.
on the application.
That was the sign-off.
It's not an approval, it's just the applicant has to be
The owner.
the HOA, yeah.
Right.
the owner.
It's really a private.
Yeah.
I think once you make it part of the ordinance, it's like saying, because whatever the ownership is, that's your concern. You can change it, it could be different, but as long as the owner signs on the application, the town will consider it.
And I mean, obviously, that's not
Yeah.
a problem, removing that. It's just, in my mind, you always had to have it anyways, but, I guess what would the ordinance look like? I'm a little confused on how we would move forward with, if we had a master plan prepared, is it still a zoning ordinance amendment? Is it a map amendment? Is it a
It's-
overlay district, a
it's
special
pot-
district?
It's, again, it can take multiple forms. I think it potentially, again, it could be an overlay on top of this. The difficulty is even as an overlay, there's still an underlining R80. So I think it's a 70-acre piece. I think you could potentially do a map amendment and rezone this as some type of, waterfront, RW, waterfront, coastal
I-
residential community. There's, but I think it's potentially its own zoning classification.
I would take it a different step, and I don't mean to step on my boss's toes, but
But he's going to.
I'm going to. In my eyes, it would be a zoning text amendment for something along the lines of a master plan community, or pick a fancy word for it or whatever. And the explanation in that ordinance would be, the purpose of it is to apply to properties like this, non-conforming properties, particularly with more than one structure on one lot, to get them more conforming. That master plan would outline the fake lot lines, or whatever you want to call it, sight lines, and then specify the zoning districts that it would mirror and establish setbacks. And I don't think there would be anything that would prevent the town, the board, or anybody from maybe even taking a stricter approach, where building height throughout town is 35 feet. Well, maybe in the R20 along the shore, specifically on this property, building height's 25, because of concerns of the association, or the fact that generally people don't want to see large 3-story structures right on the water.
To Jay's point, I've landed zones before that one of the requirements to land the zone is a master plan gets associated with it. We're saying the same thing, just slightly differently.
So can I just ask, so
Does
if
that
this,
answer your question?
Yeah, I haven't done exactly that, so, I'm not sure how it works, which is why I went with the overlay district. It's the closest thing to that I could figure out. But I think we're talking about a zone for not particularly this property, but has characteristics like
Yes.
this property, which
Exactly.
probably don't exist anywhere else in the town.
Well, I wouldn't get into the specifics. I would just say, if it's got more than one structure on the lot,
But I don't know that you want to open it up to all those properties that have that.
I mean, if the,
Right now you have Carpenters, which is in the same situation, but I believe they have their own coastal overlay.
CCOD, yes,
Yeah.
Coastal Community Overlay District.
The rest of them in town probably don't apply. I mean, there are other properties with more than one structure, but they're not a large land mass.
So the master plan, I mean, they could come in and say, hey, we want to do this, here's our master plan, and you look at it and be like, we don't have a zoning district that goes that low or high.
again, there are a few ways to do this. I've done it where you create a floating zone. You can't land the floating zone without a master plan. When the master plan lands, the zone change lands, and the master plan's tied into the zoning code for that specific site. If someone else says, I want to rezone my property in a similar way, they have to do a master plan, and it's a legislative act. That's the strongest thing that any board or commission can do, is to create the development through the legislative act of creating a zoning ordinance for it.
Susan, did you have something else?
I think that answered my question. My question was going to be whether or not then, once this special zone is created, if other communities could certainly just appeal to become part of, classified as that same zone. But you're saying there may not be other communities in town who could qualify to become this
Well,
zone?
every property would present on its own merits, its own characteristics. They're all unique. If they wanted to become a master plan community or whatever it would be called in the end, it would be based on, okay, what's the existing configuration of the property, and how's it going to break out? And the town would have the ability to say, that doesn't really make any sense. You're too congested, or we're going to put all these limitations on it because we're concerned with X, Y, and Z. It gives you the ability of kind of managing it in a better way than we have been able to do it in the past.
And just to Jamie's point about it being a legislative act, if the council was to deny a zone change, either for this zone change, or if they granted this zone change and then someone came and said, I want a similar zone change, and the council denied it, there's no review of that. If the council denies a zone change, it's a political issue, not a legal issue.
All right, thank you. All right, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Next agenda item is Planning Board Liaison Activities. Do we have anything from the Affordable Housing Collaborative?
Discussion.
I have on the list, I don't know if, we talked about, previous meeting, a site visit to the SMD project. I don't know if you have talked about that internally at all, how, when, et cetera.
We've talked about
Before
that.
TRC yesterday.
We've talked about that briefly internally. We've discussed it a little bit with council. It is before the technical review committee, so it's in the application queue. I'll continue the conversation with council on that site walk. I did reach out with the developer and ask if they would be willing to stake out where the proposed building is and some of their infrastructure. And we're going to work on the logistics of that, and I may be able to have that available so that individuals can go out to the site, and again, staff would be available to go out. Again, I'm deferring to council on the ability to do that site walk as a board when you have an application in essence in the queue.
Jamie, we've done that for years. We've had applications that are at master plan or whatever, and we go out and we have a site visit. I mean, it doesn't happen that often, but when we need to do it, we do it.
Did those site visits happen? Did those site visits happen before the hearing was opened?
Yeah.
I think that's the timing of it, I think.
It's timing.
It's usually it happens while it's before you and it's being continued and you have a site visit and
So you're suggesting that we wait until they come back with their master plan intact and then have the site visit?
until it's effectively on the table with you
Fine.
guys.
Again, the potential is I've approached the developer and asked them to mark out the site so people who want to become familiar with it now may have the option to do that. And again, it's in front of TRC. A number of items were articulated with regards to concerns that may be anticipated. So what it is today may not be what it is when it gets to the planning board as a formal application.
And then I received a communication from Lorraine Joubert at URI, who is working with different towns on the low-impact design assessment, and she sent some information to us. It's something that would be at no cost to the town, and she sent out a little description that I think that we should have a look at, and they are willing to come out and chat with us at one of our meetings. And this kind of goes along with the work that we're doing with stormwater stuff. Yes. All we need to do is invite them, and they now have an intern in place, which would not therefore require any real time or certainly no financial contribution from the town, just to do this self-assessment. Absolutely, yeah. That's a great idea, yeah. Yep. So we could invite them to,
I was just, Madam Chair, I was going to make that suggestion. If you ultimately decide to do this at one of your workshops, there's no reason you can't invite the Conservation Commission or any other interested party to attend that evening.
well, this is such a big issue that we deal with, and we deal with ramifications after the fact, post-construction, if there's an issue, and anything that we could do to make it easier and better for future residents, and for, any kind of enforcement that may or may not be necessary would benefit all of us as a whole. So, yeah, if we could perhaps get back to her and try to ask them to perhaps come to our next work session.
Okay, we'll look at the next one and then December also.
I don't have anything else from liaison planning department.
Just a couple of items. We're going through capital improvement program and already starting our fiscal year requests. So we're going to keep track of what we had in the queue on the capital side for planning studies. We've reviewed a contract from the Rhode Island Commerce on the $30,000 grant that we were going to match with 20 for a total of 50 to try and look at mixed-use development along the easterly side of Main Street going into Tower Hill up to Route 1. And we're hoping that we get responses back from Commerce with regards to our proposed revisions. And again, it's a standard contract, but it treats the town kind of like a subcontractor with liability insurance, and we have to check with the trust on whether we can name Commerce as a secondary insurer on our policy. Again, they're treating the town like we were Fuss and O'Neill or Wesson and Sampson, so we're trying to work through some of those, but we're hoping to have that available to us. Jay politely reminds me, as I have asked him in the entire month of October, to submit the RFQ for the stewardship plan. We have either $20,000 or $30,000 allocated for that study. And again, our intent would be to do a request for qualifications because we have a set dollar amount. We can get a qualified consultant on board that we would then negotiate a scope with that ceiling of that dollar amount. to try and bring the work that has already been done into a cohesive document. We also are still working on American Rescue Plan Act stuff. We submitted an RFQ, and that was sent to the street for engineering and architectural services for the EMS building on Ministerial Road. Those responses are due by 4 p.m. tomorrow. So we're hoping to get a good response on architects and engineers who will be qualified to work on that project. We're also going through the contract that we have with Weston and Sampson's and seeing there have been some changes on the federal level with regards to the accounting of the grant. And we've talked internally about how much of that we can take over because the requirements are less strenuous as originally anticipated because we're under 10 million. So we're looking at that contract and see if there's any cost savings in that, which we could then roll back into the program. And we'll see, construction or improvements with that money. Dollar General, if you have driven by recently, they're in their final stages and they're working with building as well as the planning department on requesting their certificate of occupancy. So we're going through that review.
And the Weston and Sampson project, how far along are they and how close are they to any kind of public meeting or meeting with the board? Or
So they are working on their village plans. They're probably at 90% draft on preparing those village plans. They're looking for consistency in all the presentation materials and they're vetting those internally. I reviewed one of the village plans and gave them comments on the presentation material, what they may have overlooked so that they don't overlook it 4 times over on the other village plans. So I asked that we look hard at one plan and everything associated with those so they don't push through any issues on the other plans.
how many village plans are there?
We have West Kingstown being the Amtrak area. We have Route 108 by Northrop and John Deere in that area. We have Peacedale, we have Wakefield, and we have Matunic.
But a large component of this is supposed to be for Main Street, right?
So we have roughly 4.6 million for, we'll call them capital improvements to the villages. I think some initial discussion with the town council was if you have, we'll use the dollar amount of 5 million. If we had 5 villages and spent $1 million in each one of the villages, are we going to recognize those improvements? Or do we look at spending a larger percentage of the funds in one specific area and then look to build off the successes of those changes and then capitally budget for the future renovations of the other villages? And they're not overhauls, they're refreshes, they're new street trees, street grades, street improvements, parking, bump outs, wayfinding, traffic calming. They're looking at all of those avenues. I think when they're done, it'll be a substantial financial commitment if you did all 5. But again, there may be small components that can be done in each one of those areas that are low-hanging fruit, whether it's signage or a bump out at a crosswalk, so everyone gets a little bit of it. But I think the initial council thought was to spend enough resources in at least one area so you see a substantial difference. So you recognize that you actually did something there for the betterment of the community.
Thank you.
And those are the brief items that I have.
All right. Any questions for Jamie on that? Next agenda item, update on legal issues and specifically recreational cannabis.
So, I think you received in your packets today an updated version of the recreational cannabis ordinance that you discussed at previous meetings. So, just to give you an update on what to expect is that on the ballot this November, it's going to be a townwide referendum of whether or not the town will allow cannabis retailers pursuant to the state law that was passed this last legislative session. If the town does allow retailers, then the town could start seeing licenses from the state for people that want to open up a retail business in as early as December of 2022. So with that in mind, the council wants to try to have something in place just so that, so right now, it's not allowed anywhere within town. But if the referendum is passed saying that you need to allow it, then there's at least the possibility that someone that wants to open that business would say, well, it's a commercial business, I can open it up in any commercial retail zone, treat it just like any other commercial retailer. So we've prepared this ordinance. As you can see, it has a use table on it. It's fairly restrictive at this point, but in that it allows the different types of uses allowed by the state law. They define them as the cannabis retailer, hybrid retailer, cultivator, and the definitions for that are all in the amended definition section. But it allows these uses by special use permit in the CH zone, and it also allows it in the industrial 1 zone by special use permit. Requires a development plan review as well. So any applicant would have to come to planning board first for DPR, then go to the zoning board for a special use permit. This would be in addition to their state licensing requirement. And you can see the language added with regard to the standards that would be considered at DPR. So some of them come from state law, such as can't be located within 500 feet of a pre-existing public or private school. And then some of them are kind of related to what was already in place, or mirrors what was already in place for compassion centers in the town's ordinance. So you can see that in the 5th and 6th page of the document that was circulated to you earlier today. Needs to be buffered from any residential area. Exterior appearance of the structure is consistent with the exterior appearance of the existing structures within the vicinity. There's a lighting requirement. Plans with regard to wastewater treatment. And there's also, as was discussed at the last meeting, there's a requirement that the cannabis retailers are hybrid cannabis retailers, and hybrid cannabis retailer is basically a compassion center plus recreational cannabis. Yes. No, it's not. No, it's basically in the system the state law is set up. It's set it into different stages. The testing laboratory is where it gets tested before it gets sent to the retailer. So it's not a publicly accessed.
It would be something that has pretty strict controls as far as the way they handle it and who has access to it. And
State requires with all their licensing for the Department of Business Regulation for a security plan. So the access is very limited.
I mean, just my general sense is that we're being pretty restrictive on that. Maybe
Yeah.
more so than we have to be if there's no access to the public to those facilities.
And it may be, but I guess our thought was, since it is a new use, start with a limited areas where it's allowed, and then if there's interest in expanding it to other other areas, it could always be revisited and the ordinance amended.
It would be like a chemical test. They bring in a sample there, they do a test.
There could be noxious odors, possibly, I don't know.
All right, well, that's just, I guess my 2 cents is, it seems like we're being overly restrictive on that particular.
Like, why wouldn't it be allowed in?
Other commercial areas or other industrial areas, we're talking about as a lab that, wherever they could get reasonable rent and have the proper security controls, it's not accessible to the public, I wouldn't be as concerned about it, but.
I had a question about, Use Code 101, which is the cultivation facility, and in the notes, it states that it's allowed by special use permit, and only in West Kingston, IND 1. Would there now be, with the legalization, would there now be potential for expansion of this type of facility in this location? And given the fact that it's over the G-Pod, do we need to consider specific criteria or performance standards if that were to happen, if there were an intensification because of the location of the groundwater protection overlay district?
Allowing this type of use in that zone, Madam Chairman, doesn't undermine any of the existing regulatory authority contained within the zone. So you still have your groundwater protection overlay regulations, you still have your standard industrial zone regulations, and you have the special use criteria in that permitting process, if that's the path. So,
Are there sufficient criteria within that special use permit process to allow for, again, an intensification in that environmentally sensitive area? Given the fact that there were issues with the effluent being transported off-site, at least in the previous
yeah, so
previous
again,
site plan.
if you have a 10,000 square foot manufacturing facility and you go to 20,000 square feet, all of those provisions that you would have, regardless of size, are still there and available to you. So they still have to deal with wastewater, they still have to deal with smell and containment. You wouldn't be lessening any restriction that you don't already have now just due to size or expansion.
Right, I just want to be sure that our wastewater regulations allow for this specific kind of use and intensification in that area. Are they too generic, or do we need to add to the criteria or add some kind of performance?
I mean, whether the wastewater treatment plant can handle an expansion and the effluent coming
No,
from
I'm
there?
thinking more about potential pollution for that within the G-Pod.
Again, I believe that your existing standards would cover that.
We should just be sure,
Okay.
that's the one thing that came to mind.
I just have a question about the retail facility. So I look at this as a liquor store or a CVS, and we have this in only commercial highway. I guess my question is this more of a concern? Are we concerned about the traffic, or are we concerned about the use? Because I feel like a lot of times we talk about the traffic, and I'm just trying to understand, is that why we're so regulatory on it?
So I think in looking at locations in town, and what council did is they mirrored the medical aspects, and those were limited to the highway commercial. So they didn't look at expanding the zone. They mirrored the zones that already allowed medical, with the provision that they added, at staff's suggestion, the requirement that egress, both in and out from the facilities, occurs from a state route. So those second-tier properties, 3 in from the highway commercial and Route 108, who have access to a residential neighborhood, couldn't support adult cannabis retail sales. There's only a few other zones. Peter, I know people have suggested Route 1. Route 1 is primarily zoned residential, except for the special management districts, and there's only one other commercial zone on Route 1 in the northern portion of town on the North Kingstown line where 138 comes in. It's only a few properties. The primary concern associated with these types of facilities is traffic and the ability to park your customers without having that traffic affect an intersection or safe travel in the road.
I mean, isn't the traffic, like, the reality of what I understand of this is the traffic was an issue when it wasn't legal, and then all of a sudden they made it legal. I feel like it just in the year or two of Massachusetts, if you go down to the Cape, there's plenty of marijuana facilities all along the Cape and like Wellfleet and all that. There's no traffic, there's no issue. So I'm just trying to understand, like there's traffic issues in front of Jaber's Liquor on Thanksgiving Eve, but we don't, not allow liquor stores. We just say, hey, George, get a cop to make sure traffic is fine. I mean, I don't want to get in the habit of not allowing successful businesses in our community, because that's what this says. We don't want that many people. We don't want traffic use, all that stuff. So I'm just trying to understand the intent of that.
Peter, you want to?
And it is also, according to the table, it is allowed in, well, it says it's allowed in IND 1, but it's limited to West Kingston. Was there any thought given to any other industrial parcels?
The only other industrial areas you have in town are associated with the mills and certain areas in Peacedale. So again, our initial intent was you were comfortable with the uses associated with medical being in certain locations, and council as well as staff mirrored that.
Yeah. And I think, to your point, Peter, for better or for worse, the thinking on cannabis-related uses back when you enacted the medical marijuana ordinance has changed a lot. I mean, or else the state law never would have been passed. So really, I think that there's a traffic aspect, but whenever you have a special use permit, you'll always have a site-specific traffic analysis that could be requested. But I think really all we gave you was, this is what we knew previously, that at some point a council decided this is where we're comfortable putting cannabis-related uses, and so we just put them in the same place. Your recommendation to the council could be, well, we think you should think of being a bit more expansive than you were previously, and consider allowing it in more places. But we didn't start out with that.
I have a couple of questions. I appreciate this note about direct access to Route 108 or Route 138. Is this also direct access to Route 1 Old Tower Hill Road along that commercial?
So there are no commercial highway districts associated with Route 1.
Not Route 1. Whatever Old Tower Hill Road is.
That's Route 108.
It takes a turn at Dale Carlia? No, it runs down to Wakefield to the Rotary in Narragansett. Route 108 continues through town. Old Tower Hill Road is some other number, if it has a number, right?
Our intent, if that's, our intent is to include Old Tower Hill. So we'll clarify that.
Okay, thank you. And then it also, I appreciate the access directly, but there was one of the applications we got for medical, which was a property down in Wakefield that was located right on Route 108, but they didn't have enough driveway width for in and out, so you had to exit by a little side street, which was not in a neighborhood. Would that exclude, for example, I don't want to cherry pick, but would that exclude that property from consideration, or could there be an exception if that was the property somebody proposed?
Terminology included in language, I believe, without reading it, is direct access in and out
Okay.
from, in essence, the main road. I think originally it was, direct access from the facility. I want to make it clear that it's in and out, because you could have someone who said, well, I have room for one way in and my one way out.
That was-
Affects that
That was
residential
a couple of
traffic.
properties we
The
looked
intent is direct access in and out from the main arterial or collector street.
Okay. And then I think, for me, maybe it's a little bit of the formatting, but on the first page, on page 4, there's number 1, marijuana retail facilities and/or marijuana cultivation facilities. And then in the middle of page 5, there's cannabis-related facilities. And I don't think I understand the difference, because one's 1,000 feet from schools and one's 2,000 feet from school. So could we clarify, if you go back to the table 301, exactly which of these items fall into which of these ordinances? Like which of these, I don't know what cannabis-related facilities is, as opposed to these other cannabis-related facilities. You know,
Well,
I'm not being,
Yeah, on page 4 at the top, it does say marijuana/cannabis-related uses, so I think it's one and the same.
right, but
I asked for clarification on this today from Amy, and basically the legislation, Pete, correct me if I'm wrong, the legislation that went through for medical marijuana is in our ordinance as marijuana. The new legislation with the state, it's referred to as cannabis. That is for the recreational portion. They did not go back and try to change that. So now we have to balance
That's
Ma-
just silly, isn't it?
marijuana-related, the term marijuana in the use code is for medical, and the term cannabis is for recreational. And that's because of the definitions that the state is putting forward.
okay, so on,
correct, Peter?
I don't know, I say weed and pot, so okay. So marijuana retail facilities and cultivation facilities is one thing. And then category 2 must be product manufacturing and laboratory testing? Those are your other 2 categories? Because it doesn't really specify on page 5, cannabis-related facilities, what exactly we're talking about when you talk about section 2 on the middle of page 5. I guess that's where I was confused about. Okay, so if this is retail and cultivation, this must be the other stuff, but I guess I'm just making that assumption. You know, I'm not
We
being
better
very-
have a definition in here somewhere about cannabis versus marijuana. I mean, it really is.
I think on section 2 in the middle of page 5, where it says cannabis-related facilities,
Yeah,
that's used as an umbrella term to capture all of the different cannabis uses defined in state law. So they have cannabis cultivator, cannabis product manufacturer, cannabis retailer, and cannabis testing laboratory, and hybrid cannabis retailer. So those definitions are provided there out of state law. But section 2, when it refers to cannabis-related facilities, is intended to say any of those uses with regard to cannabis, which is recreational, may be allowed by special use permit as provided in the use table, and then subject to the following conditions.
sorry, what? Sorry. Cannabis-related facilities includes retail recreational, right?
I think cannabis-related facilities includes,
But marijuana retail is different than cannabis retail.
the marijuana is from the prior ordinance where the state enacted the medical marijuana statute, the Edward O. Hawkins state, the they called it marijuana. So those definitions that are in the ordinance that say marijuana were enacted previously to refer to medical marijuana-related facilities.
So
So I
Susan,
think
just,
you're going to hear "what the heck" about 1,000,000 times when regular people try to make sense of this.
And that's why I called this afternoon, because I was like, really? Are you kidding me? You couldn't go back and clean it up?
I want to say I've been fortunate or unfortunate to go through this in 2 other states already. So if you can try and keep this straight in your mind, that marijuana retail, the M stands for medical. So anything in the regulation that says marijuana is medical marijuana. Anything that says cannabis is adult recreational use, manufacturing, production, or other. The way the legislation was written is there's kind of two distinct sections. One deals with marijuana cultivation, which has everything to do with the medical side. And the cannabis deals with the adult recreation, which is the new legislation which allows for marijuana to be, cannabis products to be sold to someone not holding a medical card. And if we didn't have a definition for marijuana retail facility and cannabis retail facility, you wouldn't be able to open a recreational facility in town because you didn't have a definition for it and the regulation didn't clarify that. So yes, Susan, I agree with you. You will probably ask people who will say, why is there a definition for marijuana retail facility and then cannabis retail facility? Don't they say the same thing? Yes, they do, but the legislature treats them differently.
So maybe a paragraph as an introduction that just,
That's
Dumbs it
potentially a
down
good
for us.
suggestion, that when we send it to council, that it includes a paragraph or two explaining that.
difference between those two terms, because I didn't, okay. And that's all I had for questions, thanks. Peacedale Mills are still number one. Like the Riverbend area and Whalers, I think those are all one.
No, Peacedale Mills is one.
One is West Kingston.
Is one.
I believe so.
And for cultivation there too, or just the lab?
So there's actually two industrial ones, three, rather.
And then you have the one across from the pump house.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
The other ID2 and ID3 are the gravel banks.
Actually, at the end of High Street also.
Oh, the mill on High Street.
Yeah, the Suez, is Suez over there?
And then, as I said earlier, I just want to be sure that we have sufficient criteria for any expansion, although now that you said that it's medical, no, that it's marijuana, which means medical, which is the only thing that would be allowed in West Kingston. Still, just to be sure that we don't endanger a non-renewable resource.
We'll double check that.
And with the timeframes associated with this, what do you need from us at this point?
So the council needs to take it up at the next hearing to be ready to go. At this point, I would say if you just give your preliminary recommendation, up, down, where you want to expand, I think the 2 points that you raised can be incorporated in your letter of recommendation. And then as it goes forward to a public hearing, if there's further iterations of it, it could be put back in front of the planning board and you can give additional comment that can be taken into the public hearing. But just so they have something that they can advertise if the town passes it at the referendum, so that they can pick out places where it will be allowed, have this process established.
So would you like that in the form of a general consensus or a motion?
A motion would be good. You know, incorporating that, and it doesn't need to be a detailed motion, but just incorporating the points that you made and directing planning staff to put together a recommendation along those lines. That works. And Jamie got all the
Good.
relevant.
I believe I did.
Motion from Joe. Is there a second?
I'll-
Second from Peter. Any further discussion?
Can I ask another question about this after we do this?
Well, no, let's ask it now.
Okay, sorry.
If there's something
So-
you want to add, we would want to amend the motion.
So number 106, Cannabis Testing Laboratory, right now, that's commercial highway. We're adding Industrial 1 anywhere in town to that?
We're suggesting that
Okay,
the council
okay,
consider adding that, yes.
okay.
It would still be an S.
Yes. And so the other question I have is you have hybrid cannabis retailer, and I think cannabis means recreational.
Yep.
But then it refers to a compassion center.
So that's,
No confusion there.
well, so that's the one section from the new act where they also referred to a compassion center, where they said, if you're a compassion center licensed under the old act to sell medical marijuana, you can get a license from the state to become a hybrid cannabis retailer to sell both recreational cannabis and medical marijuana. So that's what a hybrid cannabis retailer is.
So here, that's a special use permit in the commercial highway, but does not refer necessarily to that oh, yes, it does, to the access to 108.
Yes.
Yes, that's an,
It does refer to that.
Yes.
We'll have no emporiums in the town. Right,
Right. Yes.
thank you.
any other thoughts? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you,
I-
and
Yeah,
apologize for the late notice on that.
thanks. And I'm sure you'll keep us updated on what happens at the council level as well. Motion to adjourn? Second? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Not sure this could be any more.